The water was ice-cold and merciless. Clara Whitman fought against the Yellowstone River's current, her heavy dress dragging her down like chains. The violin case pressed against her chest, strapped tight with strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. She could lose everything, had already lost everything, but not this. Not her father's violin, not the last voice that still spoke her name. Her foot slipped on the rocky bottom. The current caught her, spinning her sideways. Water filled her mouth, her nose. She was going under. That's when she heard the splash of hooves in water. A man on horseback was coming toward her, his bay mare moving steady through the current. He didn't shout, didn't waste time with words. He just guided his mount close and reached down with one weathered hand. "Hold tight," was all he said. Clara grabbed his arm with both hands. He hauled her up behind him with one smooth pull, strong as iron, gentle as necessary. The horse turned toward the far bank while Clara pressed her face against the stranger's back, feeling the violin case dig into her ribs and not caring. She was alive. On solid ground, she slid down from the horse, dripping and shivering. The man dismounted and studied her with gray eyes that held no judgment, only quiet assessment. He was what Montana Territory made of men who stayed and survived, weathered by sun and work, steady as stone. He shrugged out of his wool coat and held it out to her. "There's coffee and a fire half a mile up the trail," he said. His voice was like his movements, sure, economical. "Name's Elias McGraw." "Clara Whitman," she managed through chattering teeth. He nodded once, as if her name was answer enough to questions he didn't need to ask. As they walked toward his ranch, Clara wrapped in his coat that smelled of leather and wood smoke. She felt something she hadn't felt in months. The possibility that she wasn't walking toward another ending, but toward a beginning. Behind them, the river carried away the coin purse that had held her last few dollars. But somehow, following this quiet stranger up a dusty trail with her father's violin safe against her chest, Clara felt richer than she had in years. Elias McGraw's house sat in a bowl between hills, built for survival, not beauty. Logs chinked with mud, a roof that shed weather without complaint, windows positioned to watch all approaches. The barn and outbuildings formed a defensive square around a dusty yard where chickens scattered at their arrival at Ak. Inside, the house smelled of coffee grounds, wood smoke, and solitude. The main room served every purpose: kitchen, dining, sitting area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cook stove nearby radiating welcome heat. The furniture was handmade and practical. What struck Clara most was what wasn't there. No photographs, no decorations beyond a rifle on wooden pegs, no sign that hope lived here. "There's dry clothes in that chest," Elias said, pointing to a corner. "Nothing fancy, but clean." He left her alone to change. Inside the wooden trunk, Clara found women's clothing that told a story she could only guess at. A blue calico dress, well made but faded, undergarments carefully mended, a wool shawl darned with loving hands. The clothes were too large. They'd belonged to a taller woman, but they were dry and smelled faintly of lavender. When she emerged, Elias was setting coffee on the stove. He glanced at her once, nodded approval, then busied himself with cups and sugar. "Better?" he asked. "Much better. These clothes belong to my wife." His voice was carefully neutral. "She died 2 winters back, fever." The way he said it, matter of fact and final, told Clara this ground was marked with warnings. She didn't push. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Long time ago, DeWitt. He poured coffee and sat across from her. What about you? Where were you headed when the river got hold of you? That's when Clara told him about her father, Thomas Whitman, who had been a traveling musician with hands that could coax beauty from worn strings and a heart that heard music everywhere. About the small house outside Lawrence where he'd repaired instruments and taught farmers' children to play for pennies, and sometimes just supper. Listen, Clara, she remembered him saying, his calloused fingers guiding hers on the fingerboard. The violin doesn't make the music. You do. It just translates what's in your heart into something others can hear. She told Elias about her mother's death when Clara was 7. Consumption, the doctor had said, though Clara remembered her mother's cough sounding almost musical. About burying her father 3 months ago with nothing but debts to inherit except his violin. About writing to Aunt Sarah in Oregon, her father's sister who'd married a lumber merchant and promised family took care of family. But when I got there, Clara's voice caught. The house was empty. Neighbors said the business failed. Sarah died of fever 2 weeks before I arrived. I was standing in that dusty street, and I realized I was alone, not temporarily, permanently. Elias sipped his coffee, gray eyes studying her face. Montana Territory's hard country for a woman alone, he said finally. Harder than starving in Oregon? Something almost like a smile crossed his weathered features. Fair point. He moved to the window, looking out at gathering clouds. Storm coming. You can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll see what comes next. That first night, Clara lay on a bedroll by the fire, listening to wind test the walls and the stranger's quiet breathing. The violin case sat beside her. She wanted to open it, to play, but something held her back. This house had its own silence, careful and protected, and she sensed it wasn't ready for music yet. The next morning brought rain that turned the yard to mud and made travel impossible. When Clara started gathering her things, Elias stopped her with a look. Roads'll be soup for days, Wes, he said. Besides, there's work that needs doing. And so began Clara's education in ranch life. Elias wasn't a teacher in any way Clara recognized. He didn't explain or demonstrate. He just did what needed doing and let her figure out how to help. Water came from a well 50 paces from the house. The buckets were heavy, the rope rough. First day she spilled half the water. Second day, still spilled a third. By the end of the week she made it back with full buckets and blistered hands. Elias saw the raw skin but said nothing, just left a jar of salve on the kitchen table. Firewood was another battle. The logs seemed heavy as stone, the axe clumsy in her grip. She'd swing and miss, or connect wrong, and nearly lose her balance. Elias would watch from the corner of his eye while mending harness or sharpening tools. When she finally split a piece clean through, he gave a small nod, not praise, recognition. Her soft town hands grew calloused. Her back ached from hauling water and feed. But with each small victory, bread that rose right, eggs gathered without breaking, a fire that burned steady through the night. Clara felt something growing she hadn't felt since her father's death. Purpose, the satisfaction of useful work. It was the evenings that tested her most. With chores done and supper finished, silence would settle over the house heavy as a blanket. Elias would sit by the fire, sometimes carving, sometimes just staring into the flames. Clara would mend or clean, always aware of the violin case by her bedroll. Her fingers ached to hold the instrument, to fill the quiet with something besides crackling wood. But she waited. This man had given her shelter when she had nothing. The least she could do was respect the careful peace he'd built around his grief. 2 weeks passed before need finally overcame caution. It was a clear night, cold enough for frost on the windows. Elias had gone to bed early with a headache. Clara sat by the dying fire, darning socks and fighting restlessness that felt like hunger. Finally, she set aside the mending and quietly lifted the violin case. The latches opened with soft clicks. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay her father's violin. The varnish was worn smooth where hands had held it, loved it, made it sing. There was a small crack near the bridge that her father had called a battle scar. "Shows it's been played, not just kept pretty," he'd said. Clara lifted the instrument, checking for damage from its river baptism. The wood seemed sound. She tightened the bow, adjusted the strings, made small corrections until it sang true. Then she placed it under her chin and began to play. Softly, barely above a whisper, old Irish airs her father had taught her, melodies that spoke of longing and loss, gentle waltzes that had once filled their small house with warmth. Each song was a conversation with memory, a way of touching the past without drowning in it. What Clara didn't know was that Elias lay awake in the next room, listening. It had been 2 years since music lived in this house, 2 years since Martha had hummed while she cooked, sang while she tended her garden. The silence after her death had seemed like peace, no reminders, no echoes. But as Clara's music drifted through the darkness, Elias realized what he'd taken for peace had actually been death. Not of grief, but of hope. Of everything that made a house into a home. The next morning he was quieter than usual, not unfriendly, just thoughtful, as if he was reconsidering something he'd thought was settled. Days fell into rhythm. Clara worked, learned, grew stronger. Evenings, she played violin while Elias sat by the fire, listening without comment. The music became conversation between them, her melodies speaking what words couldn't say, his presence answering that she was heard. But they both knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Eventually they'd need supplies from town. Eventually the outside world would intrude on the careful peace they'd built together. The test came sooner than either expected. Bitter Creek lived up to its name. The town squatted in a valley bend, like it was tired of moving, and too stubborn to die. Main Street was rutted dirt between sagging boardwalks. The saloon at one end leaked noise and whiskey fumes. The church at the other end seemed to lean away from it in perpetual disapproval. 2 weeks after harvest, supplies ran low enough to require a town trip. Elias hitched the wagon with his usual care. When Clara asked to come along, he considered her request with those measuring gray eyes. "Keep close," he said finally. "Don't take anything personal." Clara didn't understand the warning until they reached Main Street. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Women paused in their shopping to study the stranger riding beside McGraw. Men outside the saloon straightened up for a better look. The attention wasn't friendly curiosity. It was assessment, judgment, the kind of scrutiny that stripped away privacy and left you feeling naked. At Green's General Store, the tension exploded. Nate Green was built like a whiskey barrel, with arms thick from hefting cargo, and a belly that advertised his own goods. His face was red from weather and drink, and his eyes held the sharp cunning of a man who traded in other people's business. "Well, McGraw," he said loud enough for the whole store to hear, "ain't you going to introduce us to your visitor?" The pause before visitor was loaded with implications that made Clara's cheeks burn. Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Need salt, flour, and coffee," he said, ignoring the question. Green's smile turned ugly. "Now that ain't neighborly, Elias. Here you got yourself a house guest, and you don't even tell us her name." Before Clara could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "Heard McGraw pulled something pretty out of the river. Didn't know it was this pretty." The speaker had been watching from the porch when they rode in. Shorter than most men, but compact, like a coiled spring. His clothes were better quality, wool instead of denim, boots recently oiled. But his pale blue eyes held a coldness that made Clara's skin crawl. "Silas Boone," Elias said, and there was warning in how he spoke the name. Elias. Boone touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. His hand rested casual on his gun belt, and Clara noticed he wore his Colt positioned for a quick draw. "Just welcoming newcomers to our community. Course, some folks might wonder what services a young lady provides way out here. Territory's hard on women who ain't established." The insult was clear enough that even Clara, sheltered as her raising had been, understood. Heat flooded her face. Before she could speak, Elias stepped between them. "Clara's situation ain't your concern, Boone." "See? That's where you're wrong." Boone's voice carried through the store. His right hand stayed near his gun, casual but ready. "What happens on one ranch touches us all. Property values, community reputation. When a man starts taking in strays—" He shrugged. "Folks wonder what other charity might be available." Several customers stopped pretending not to listen. Clara felt every eye cataloging her borrowed clothes, worn boots, obvious dependence on Elias's kindness. The violin case on her back suddenly felt like evidence of her uselessness. Elias's hand moved to his belt knife. His voice dropped to a level that somehow carried more threat than shouting. "You got something specific to say, Boone. Say it plain." For a moment the two men faced each other in silence, thick as smoke. Then Boone laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "No need to get riled, just looking out for community interests." He turned to Clara with that cold smile. "River brings more than fish sometimes. Brings trouble, too. You take care, miss." He touched his hat and walked out, spurs ringing on the plank floor. Green, apparently deciding the show was over, began gathering their supplies with elaborate casualness. $4.30, he said. The ride home passed in heavy silence. Finally, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. "I should leave. I'm bringing you trouble." Elias drove the wagon steady as always, eyes on the trail ahead. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Trouble finds people whether they invite it or not. Question is what you do when it shows up." "But if I wasn't here?" "Boone'd find something else to poke at. Men like him need someone to push around." He glanced at her. "You didn't start this, Clara. Running won't finish it." That night, Clara lay awake thinking about Boone's pale eyes and mocking smile. She'd met his kind before, men who used others' weakness for sport, but she'd never been the target of such focused malice. 3 days later, Elias returned from town with news. Boone had been busy. Stories were spreading about McGraw's house guest. Some said she was a fallen woman seeking refuge. Others claimed she was a grifter after a lonely man's money. The kindest version said she was just Charity McGraw was too decent to refuse. Let them talk, Elias said when Clara pressed for details. But she could see the cost in the tension around his eyes, the way he checked the horizon each morning. A week passed, then another. Clara threw herself into ranch work with desperate energy, as if proving useful might counter Boone's poison. She learned to milk the cow without getting kicked, gather eggs without breaking them, churn butter that didn't taste like soap. Her hands grew rougher, her back stronger. But competence couldn't erase the feeling she was a burden Elias bore from kindness, not need. Late September brought the confrontation they'd both been dreading. Clara was mending harness in the barn when she heard horses approaching. Through the open door, she saw 3 riders coming up the valley. Even at distance, she recognized Boone's pale hat and compact build. He hadn't come alone. She slipped deeper into shadow and watched them rein up in the yard. Boone dismounted with casual arrogance, his men following. One was Jake Morrison from the blacksmith shop. The other was a tall stranger with a drooping mustache and the look of hired muscle. Elias emerged from the house, movements unhurried but alert. He didn't invite them to dismount or offer the hospitality that would have been automatic under other circumstances. Boone. McGraw. Boone pushed his hat back, looking around the yard like a man appraising property. Nice spread. Shame if anything happened to it. Something on your mind? Matter of fact, there is. Boone's voice carried clear across the yard. Been hearing things in town. Stories about your arrangement with that girl. Some decent folks are getting concerned. Concerned about what? About example it sets, what it says about our community when we allow certain irregularities. Boone's smile was thin as a knife blade. His hand rested easy on his gun butt. Now, I ain't saying nothing improper's going on, but appearances matter. Unmarried woman living under your roof, no proper chaperone, no visible means of support, raises questions. What kind of questions? Like what services she might provide for your hospitality. The words hung in the air like the smell of something rotting. Clara's face burned with shame and rage, but she forced herself to stay hidden. Elias's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. That's a serious accusation, Boone. Just pointing out how things look, suggesting maybe it's time Miss Whitman moved on for everyone's sake. And if she doesn't? Boone's smile widened, but his eyes stayed winter cold. Territory's got laws about public morality. Enough decent citizens sign a petition about irregularities. Well, territorial marshal might feel obliged to investigate. Man could lose his property over the wrong kind of reputation. You threatening me? Just a concerned citizen looking after community welfare. Boone leaned forward in his saddle. His fingers drummed against his holster. You got till month's end to sort this situation. After that, other folks might take a more active interest in your affairs. He touched his hat and turned his horse toward town, the others following. Clara watched them ride away, heart hammering with fear and fury. She'd brought this poison to Elias's door. Now Boone was using her presence as a weapon against a man who'd shown her nothing but kindness. That evening, as they sat down to sparse supper, Clara tried to find words for what she'd witnessed. But how do you apologize for being the cause of a man's troubles? How do you thank someone for protecting you when it might cost him everything? I heard what Boone said, Ihwa, she finally managed. Elias looked up from his plate, gray eyes unreadable. Figured you might have. He's using me to hurt you. I can't let that happen. What exactly are you planning to do about it? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected argument, maybe even agreement, not this calm inquiry that forced her to examine her own intentions. I could leave, find work somewhere. Where? The simple words stripped away her noble intentions. She had no money, no connections, no skills that would earn a living wage. Winter was coming. A woman alone on the frontier faced dangers beyond gossip and social disapproval. I don't know, she admitted, but I can't stay and watch you lose everything because of me. Elias was quiet, hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Know what I learned in the war, Clara? Sometimes worst thing you can do is give ground to a bully. Once they see you'll back down, they never stop pushing. Clara stared. The war? Gettysburg, Antietam. His voice was matter-of-fact, but she caught old pain underneath. Lost good men to fellows who thought they could take what they wanted through fear. Learned sometimes the only way to stop a bully is make him understand the cost of bullying. But this isn't a war. Ain't it? He met her eyes. Boone's trying to drive you off because he can't stand someone like you finding a place here, not because you done wrong, but because you threaten something he thinks he controls. Fai Ramu. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of shame and fear she'd carried since that first day in Green's store. For the first time since Boone started his campaign, she let herself consider not running. 2 days later, the sabotage began. Clara woke to find the chicken coop torn open, birds scattered or dead. Elias examined the damage with grim efficiency. Wasn't coyotes, he said, pointing to boot prints in the mud. Human mischief. The next morning they found fence posts cut and cattle wandering. The day after, someone had poured sand in the well, making the water undrinkable until they could bail it clean. Boone? Clara asked. His style, pressure without direct confrontation. Elias's jaw was tight. Man's trying to cost me time and money, make me choose between fixing his damage and keeping you safe. That evening, as Clara helped repair what could be fixed, she felt anger replace fear. These weren't just attacks on Elias. They were attacks on the life she was building, the home she'd found. For the first time since Kansas, she had something worth fighting for. That night she opened her violin case. The instrument gleamed in firelight, worn varnish catching golden radiance. She lifted it with hands that had grown strong from ranch work, placed it under her chin, and began to play. Not the tentative whispers of her first weeks here, but something fierce. Music that spoke of roots growing deep, of storms weathered, of a voice that refused to be silenced. She played defiance and determination, love found and defended. From the kitchen where Elias sat cleaning his rifle came the sound of work stopping. She knew he was listening, and for the first time, that knowledge felt like strength instead of performance. This was conversation in a language deeper than words. When the last note faded, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not hope exactly, but something more solid. Certainty. Some things were worth fighting for, even when you weren't sure you'd win. Outside, wind rattled windows and set loose boards creaking. Winter was coming with cold that could kill the unprepared. But inside the house, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, of music waiting to be born, of two people who'd found something worth defending together. Clara didn't know what Boone would try next, but she knew she wouldn't face it by running. This place had become her home, and home was something you stood and fought for. even when the odds looked impossible. November came to Montana like a stalking wolf, silent and deadly patient. The first snow arrived on a windless night, falling in fat flakes that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. By morning, the world was white and hushed, fence posts wearing caps of snow, bare cottonwood branches outlined in silver. Winter meant isolation, but it also meant community. The scattered ranchers and townspeople of the territory knew that survival depended on helping each other through the killing months. So when the invitation arrived, carried by Mary Henderson through drifting snow, Clara understood it for what it really was, a test. The winter dance. Every December, Bitter Creek put aside its differences for one night of music, food, and the pretense that civilization had found a foothold in the wilderness. This year, Clara's attendance would be seen as a declaration that she was staying, that Elias supported her, that they were willing to face whatever consequences came from defying Boone's whispers. "Whole town will be there," Mary said, warming her hands by Clara's fire. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who'd raised 6 children on the frontier. Music, dancing, plenty of food. Of course, some folks might not be too welcoming. She glanced meaningfully at Clara, but others figure it's time this nonsense stopped. Time people made up their own minds instead of listening to troublemakers. After Mary left, Clara and Elias sat in the kitchen, the invitation lying between them like a challenge. Clara understood the stakes. If they went together, it would be seen as confirmation that whatever existed between them was worth defending publicly. If they stayed away, it would be admission of shame, proof that Boone's campaign had worked. "We don't have to go," Elias said quietly. "Yes, we do." Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. "If we hide, we let him win without even fighting." The next day, despite bitter cold and uncertain roads, they made the journey to town. But instead of Green's store, Elias drove to a small house where a wooden sign read, "Mrs. Flynn, Dressmaking." Margaret Flynn was tiny and silver-haired, with blue eyes sharp as needles, and a manner that brooked no nonsense. She'd come west 20 years ago and stayed after her husband died because, as she put it, "I've put too much work into civilizing this place to abandon it now." "Need a dress for the dance," Elias said without preamble. Mrs. Flynn looked Clara up and down with professional assessment. 3 days to make something proper," she said, already reaching for her measuring tape. "But I've got something that might work with alterations." She disappeared into the back room and emerged with a gown of deep blue wool, simply cut but elegant. Made it for the banker's daughter, but she ran off with a traveling preacher before the final fitting. As Mrs. Flynn pinned and tucked, she kept up steady conversation that was equal parts gossip and intelligence gathering. She knew about Boone's campaign, knew about the threats and innuendo. "Silas Boone," she said around a mouthful of pins, "mistakes meanness for strength. I've watched him before. Picks on folks who can't fight back. But sometimes—" her smile was grim. "Sometimes his targets surprise him." When the alterations were complete, Clara barely recognized herself in the mirror. The blue wool brought out her eyes, and the fitted bodice and flowing skirt transformed her from work-worn ranchwoman into someone who could hold her own in any social situation. "You bring that violin to the dance," Mrs. Flynn said as Clara changed back to everyday clothes. "This town needs reminding what music sounds like when it comes from the heart." The days leading up to the dance passed in anxious preparation. Clara practiced until her fingers were sore, trying to choose songs that might serve her cause. Something too simple would suggest lack of skill. Too complex might seem like showing off. Finally, she settled on pieces her father had taught her, melodies that spoke of home and belonging. Meanwhile, Elias made preparations of his own. He cleaned and oiled his good boots, pressed his best shirt, spent an afternoon trimming his hair and sharpening his razor. Clara had never seen him pay such attention to appearance, and the sight of him making effort on her behalf made something flutter in her chest. The night of the dance arrived clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. Clara dressed carefully in her blue gown, braided her hair into an elaborate knot, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. When she emerged from behind her blanket partition, she found Elias waiting by the door in his good clothes, looking uncomfortable but determined. "You look—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You look like a lady." "And you look like a gentleman," she replied, meaning it. Dressed up with his hair neatly combed, Elias looked less like a weathered rancher and more like the man he must have been before life stripped away everything but essentials. Donohue's hall blazed with light and warmth. Paper streamers hung from the rafters, and oil lamps cast flickering shadows on walls lined with benches. A small stage at one end held 3 musicians, fiddle, accordion, and spoons. The hall was packed with what seemed like half the territory: cowboys in their best shirts, ranch families with children darting between adults' legs, the town's more prosperous citizens claiming tables near the front. As Clara and Elias entered, conversation didn't stop exactly, but it shifted. Voices lowered to urgent whispers, heads turned to track their progress. Clara felt scrutiny like physical weight, but Elias's steady presence beside her was an anchor. They found seats near the back, close enough to see but far enough to allow conversation. Almost immediately, neighbors began stopping by. The Hendersons, the Kellys who ran the feed store, the widow Patterson who taught school. Not everyone had been poisoned by Boone's campaign. Some people were willing to judge Clara by her actions, not gossip. The realization gave her courage. When Tom Henderson asked her to dance, she accepted with a genuine smile. He was skilled enough to guide her through waltzes and reels without making her feel clumsy. Other partners followed, neighbors who'd decided to welcome her, cowboys more interested in a new face than old gossip. But Clara was always aware of the knot of men around the punch bowl, where Boone held court with his supporters. Green was there, along with others she recognized from town. They didn't approach directly, but she could feel their attention like thorns against her skin. The confrontation came near evening's end. The musicians had taken a break, and the hall settled into comfortable buzz of conversation and laughter. Clara was discussing spring planting with the Hendersons when a voice cut through the noise. "Well, well, if it ain't our famous house guest." Silas Boone appeared at their table, punch glass in hand, and malice in his pale eyes. Conversation around them died as people sensed trouble brewing. Elias tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "Mr. Boone," Clara said coolly, placing a restraining hand on Elias's arm. This was her fight as much as his. "Enjoying the dance, Miss Whitman? Always enjoy watching folks express themselves?" His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Speaking of which, I hear you play violin. Perhaps you'd favor us with a tune?" It was challenge disguised as request, and everyone present understood. If Clara played poorly, it would confirm Boone's narrative that she was useless burden. If she refused, it would seem like cowardice. Clara felt every eye in the hall focused on her. Fear nearly overwhelmed her, fear of failure, of public humiliation, of giving Boone ammunition to destroy what she'd built. Then she thought of her father's hands guiding hers on the fingerboard, his voice saying music didn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. She thought of evenings by the fire when Elias listened to her play, the way his weathered face softened with something approaching peace. "I'd be honored," she said, rising with grace that belied her trembling hands. She carried the violin case to the small stage, aware that complete silence had fallen over the hall. Even children had stopped their chatter. Clara opened the case with steady fingers, lifted the instrument that had been her companion through loss and hope, and took position at the front of the stage. She didn't announce what she would play. Instead, she placed the violin under her chin, closed her eyes, and began. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, opening bars of a melody her father had taught her years ago. Simple tune that children learned and grandmothers hummed while working. But as Clara's confidence grew, the music began to soar, filling every corner of the hall with sound both familiar and startlingly fresh. She played of longing and loss, of pain that comes from leaving everything familiar. But she also played of hope, of courage it took to start over, of finding unexpected beauty in harsh places. The melody wove through variations that spoke of winter storms, weathered, of small kindnesses that meant difference between survival and surrender, of how two solitary hearts could find harmony without losing individual voices. The hall was absolutely still. No whispered conversations, no shuffling feet, no crying children, just music and silence that held it, gave it space to breathe and touch every heart present. When the final note faded, quiet stretched for what felt like eternity. Then from the back of the hall came sound of single pair of hands clapping. Clara opened her eyes to see Elias rising from his chair, gray eyes fixed on her face with expression she'd never seen. Pride, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart skip. Applause spread through the hall like wildfire. Not everyone joined. She could see Boone's supporters sitting in sullen silence. But enough people were clapping, enough voices calling for another song, that Clara knew something fundamental had changed. The music had spoken for her in ways words never could. She played 2 more pieces before setting the violin back in its case. As she stepped down from the stage, neighbors surrounded her with congratulations, compliments, requests for future performances. Even some cowboys who'd been drinking Boone's poison were nodding approval. But it was Elias's reaction that mattered most. When she finally made her way back to their table, he stood and offered his arm with formality that seemed to encompass everything he couldn't say in words. "May I have this dance, Miss Whitman?" The musicians had returned and struck up a waltz. As Elias led Clara onto the floor, she was aware they were center of attention. But for the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, attention felt welcoming rather than hostile. People were watching not to find fault, but to witness something significant, moment when an outsider became part of the community. Elias was better dancer than she'd expected, moving with same quiet competence he brought to everything. As they circled the floor, Clara found herself studying his face in the lamplight, seeing details she'd missed. The way his eyes crinkled when pleased, small scar on his jaw from some long-ago accident, strength in his hands that held her firmly but gently. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For believing in me, for standing by me when it would have been easier to let me go. Elias drew her closer. Clara, he said quietly, you proved yourself the day you stepped out of that river with nothing but a violin and courage to start over. Everything else is just conversation. The waltz ended, but they remained on the floor for the next song and the one after. Other couples joined them, and gradually the evening settled back into comfortable rhythm of successful celebration. It was then that Boone made his final play. He'd been drinking heavy, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. As the music ended, he stepped onto the stage, swaying slightly. "Folks," he called out, voice slurred but carrying, "before we all get too carried away with pretty music and sentiment, maybe we should remember what kind of woman we're celebrating here." The hall went dead quiet. Elias started toward the stage, but Clara caught his arm. "Let him hang himself," she whispered. "This woman," Boone continued, pointing an unsteady finger at Clara, "shows up with nothing but a fiddle and a sob story. No family, no references, no proof of character. For all we know, she could be running from the law, could be diseased, could be—" That's enough." The voice came from an unexpected source. Doc Riley, the territory's only physician, stood up from his table near the front. He was a small man with steel-gray whiskers and the quiet authority that came from pulling people back from death's door. "I've examined Miss Whitman," he said clearly, "at Mr. McGraw's request, to ensure she carried no illness from her travels. She's as healthy and virtuous as any woman in this room. More than some, I'd wager." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mary Henderson stood next. "I've worked alongside Clara preparing for tonight," she announced. "She's got more grit and kindness in her little finger than Silas Boone has in his whole sorry carcass." More voices joined in. Tom Henderson, the Kellys, even some of the Cowboys who'd danced with Clara earlier. One by one, people who'd gotten to know her stood and spoke. Not grand speeches, just simple truths about help given, kindness shown, work done without complaint. Boone looked around the room, realizing he'd lost more than just this battle. The community that had tolerated his poison was rejecting it. His face darkened with rage. "You're all fools," he snarled. "Mark my words, you'll regret this. That woman will bring nothing but trouble. He stumbled off the stage and pushed through the crowd toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "This ain't over, McGraw, not by a long shot." The door slammed behind him, leaving uncomfortable silence. Then the fiddle player struck up a lively reel, and gradually conversation resumed. But Clara noticed that people seemed to stand a little straighter, speak a little louder, as if they'd passed some kind of test. As the evening wound down and families began gathering children and saying farewells, Clara found herself surrounded by neighbors offering friendship, invitations, acceptance. The transformation was remarkable. In the space of one evening, she'd gone from community outcast to valued member. "Ready to go home, Mrs. McGraw?" Elias asked, appearing at her elbow with her cloak. Clara started. "Mrs." Elias's weathered face was serious as stone. "Been thinking about what you said earlier, about proving yourself, about standing by each other." He paused, seeming to gather words that didn't come easy. "Seems to me we've been doing that already, just haven't made it official." Clara stared at him, her heart hammering. "Elias McGraw, are you proposing to me in the middle of a dance hall?" "Reckon I am." His gray eyes held steady on hers. if you'll have a stubborn rancher who's probably too set in his ways to change much. Clara reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'll have you exactly as you are," she said, "but I'm keeping my violin." His smile was like sunrise after long night. "Wouldn't want you without it." The wedding took place on first Sunday in April, when snow had finally retreated to the highest peaks, and wildflowers were beginning to show color in the valley grass. It was simple ceremony in the raw wood church, with most of the community in attendance, and Clara's violin providing music that filled the small space with joy. Reverend Morrison, brought in from Helena for the occasion, spoke of love as covenant between souls, of how unexpected grace could transform hardest ground into fertile soil. But for Clara, standing beside Elias in her blue wool dress, the real ceremony was in the exchange of looks, joining of hands, quiet certainty that they were promising to face whatever came as partners. The reception filled Donohue's hall again, and half the county seemed to have contributed to the feast. There was dancing, stories, toasts offered in everything from good whiskey to Mrs. Patterson's apple cider. Even Nate Green, apparently deciding respectability had won the day, offered grudging congratulations and a bolt of calico as wedding gift. Silas Boone was notably absent. He'd left for Colorado the week after the dance, debts unpaid, and few regrets from those he abandoned. His departure had lifted shadow from the community, allowing relationships to settle back into natural patterns. As afternoon wore on and celebration wound down, Clara found herself on the hall steps, watching sun sink toward western mountains while neighbors said farewells. Elias appeared beside her, solid and reassuring in his wedding clothes. "Tired?" he asked. "Happy," she corrected, leaning into his warmth. "Tired and happy and amazed how much can change in 1 year." He followed her gaze toward the mountains, where last light painted snow-covered peaks, pink and gold. "Seems like longer sometimes, like you've always been here." Clara thought about the woman who'd stepped into the Yellowstone River with nothing but violin and desperation. About all the ways she'd changed and grown. The calluses on her hands told one story, the easy way she moved through ranch rhythms told another. But perhaps the most important change was internal knowledge that she'd found not just home, but place where she was valued for exactly who she was. "I was thinking about what Martha said," Clara murmured. "That music doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful." She was always wise about things like that. I think she would have approved of us. Elias was quiet a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "No, she would have," he said finally. "She always said worst thing about dying young was leaving people alone who were meant to have company." They stood in comfortable silence as stars began appearing in darkening sky. Around them, sounds of celebration gradually faded as last guests departed and Hall settled into quiet. "Ready to go home, Mrs. McGraw?" Elias asked. The name still gave Clara a small thrill. "Ready," she said. The wagon ride back to their valley was filled with easy talk about the day, about plans for spring planting, about small improvements they wanted to make. Practical conversation, but underlaid with deeper music of two lives beginning to weave together. As they turned toward home, Clara caught sight of the Yellowstone River glinting in moonlight, the same river that had nearly claimed her life a year ago. But instead of fear or bad memories, she felt only gratitude. That crossing, terrifying as it had been, brought her to this moment, this place, this man who'd become her partner in every way that mattered. The house looked different in moonlight, warmer somehow. Windows glowed yellow, with lamplight left burning for their return, and smoke rose straight up from chimney in still air. It looked like what it had become, home rather than just shelter. Inside, Clara moved through familiar routine of banking fire and preparing for bed. But everything felt different tonight, charged with significance of change, of promises made, and futures chosen. When she opened Violin case to put the instrument away after days playing, she found herself pausing to study it. The violin looked exactly as it had that day by river, worn varnish, small cracks that spoke of years of love. But its meaning had evolved, deepened. Still her father's voice, still connection to past, but also something new. Bridge between old life and new, gift she could offer to community that had learned to welcome her, conversation she could have with husband in language they both understood. "Will you play something?" Elias asked from where he sat on edge of their bed, pulling off good boots. Clara lifted Violin one more time, settled it under chin, and began to play. Not one of sad songs that marked her first lonely months at ranch, not challenging pieces she'd used to prove herself at dance, but something new, melody that seemed to compose itself as she played, flowing from fingers without conscious thought. It was song of gratitude, of love found in unexpected places, of two solitary people who'd discovered they could create harmony without losing individual voices. It spoke of seasons turning, hard work rewarded, way morning light looked different when you woke beside someone who understood language of your silences. When last note faded, Clara set Violin carefully back in case and turned to find Elias watching her with expression of such tenderness it took her breath away. "What was that song?" he asked. "I don't know," Clara admitted. I think it might be ours." "Ours?" "The song of us, of this place, this life we're building together. It doesn't have name yet, but maybe we'll spend next 50 years figuring out what it's supposed to sound like." Elias crossed to her and took her hands in his, calloused palms, warm against skin. 50 years sounds like good start," he said, and kissed her with all patience and passion of man who'd learned best things in life were worth waiting for. Outside, wind sighed through cottonwoods, and Yellowstone River continued its ancient journey toward sea. But inside house, two people who'd found each other across vast loneliness of territory settled into their first night as husband and wife, secure in knowledge they'd built something that could weather any storm. The violin rested silent in its case, but music it represented, song of home and belonging, of love discovered and nurtured, of two voices learning to harmonize. That music would continue to play in their hearts for all years to come. This is the story of Clara Whitman McGraw, who crossed a river carrying only a violin and discovered that sometimes the most dangerous crossings lead to the safest harbors. It's the story of Elias McGraw, who learned that a house becomes home not when you fill it with things, but when you fill it with someone whose presence makes the silence sing. It's the story of a community that discovered the difference between protecting their values and protecting their fears, between judgment and discernment. But most of all, it's the story of music, not just the kind that comes from instruments, but deeper music that emerges when two lives find their rhythm together. The music of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of work done side by side, of conversations that happen in glances across crowded rooms. In years that followed, Clara became known throughout territory as Woman Who Brought Music Back to Bitter Creek. She played at weddings and funerals, harvest celebrations, and Christmas gatherings. Children learned their first songs from her teaching, and visiting musicians sought her out to share melodies and techniques. But those who knew her best understood that her greatest performance was quieter, more subtle. The way she'd transformed one man's solitude into partnership, one house's silence into complex harmony of true home. The Yellowstone still runs through Montana, carrying snowmelt and promises toward Missouri and points beyond. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes treacherous, always changing, yet always same. And sometimes, if you listen carefully on quiet evening when wind is right, you might hear something carried on its current. Echo of music played long ago by woman who learned that home isn't place you're born to, but song you choose to sing with someone who knows how to listen. Because in end, that's what love is. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but daily decision to keep making music together, even when song is difficult, even when audience doesn't understand, even when you're not sure you remember all the words. Clara and Elias made that music for 53 years, until age finally stilled their voices. But song they created together continues to play in Valley, where their ranch still stands, in children who learned first melodies from Clara's patient teaching, in way community learned to welcome strangers, and trust and power of second chances. If this story has touched something in your heart, don't let silence stand between you and music you're meant to make. There are melodies waiting to be discovered, harmonies yearning to be born. Because every story we share here is a reminder that love, like music, doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. It just has to be true.